Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
The GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. It is Tuesday. I hope you had a wonderful weekend. I hope it involved a lot of staying home, unless it was absolutely necessary to go out. Please do everything you can to flatten the curve. It's very much appreciated. It was a very quiet weekend for us. My hubby wasn't feeling well, so he just kind of laid low. I did a lot of work on different stuff. Working from home is interesting for me because it's harder for me to not be distracted by everything. But I'm doing okay. I'm getting there. I'm maybe starting to develop a rhythm, hopefully. One of the things that I got to do over the weekend, which is one of the things that I often do over weekends, is speak to an author, which you know I love. This week's author is Bryan Gruley. We spoke about his new book. It's called Purgatory Bay. It is a thriller, and I'll give you the description. She can't forgive. She won't forget. She will avenge. Jubilee Rathman is a straight-A student and star soccer goalie destined for Princeton until her family is brutally murdered. 12 years later, she lives in a virtual fortress on Purgatory Bay near Bleak Harbor, plotting revenge on the people she considers responsible. In her crosshairs is former reporter Michaela "Mikey" Deming, who Jubilee believes got her family in trouble with the Detroit mob. As retribution, Jubilee kidnaps Mikey's sister and daughter, and that's just the start in her ruthless quest for justice. Bleak Harbor Police Chief Katya Malone, still reeling from her failure to find a kidnapped boy, leads the investigation. She's determined to keep history from repeating, but Jubilee is more cunning than Malone can imagine. All Mikey and Katya can do is follow Jubilee's dangerous trail of clues. But in Bleak Harbor, nothing is what it seems, and no one can be trusted. As an ominous end draws ever nearer, the women must face the misdeeds of the past to find the kidnapping victims before it's too late. Again, that is the description of Purgatory Bay, the new novel by Bryan Gruley. It is a thriller. First, let me just backtrack one little bit. So, I don't know if you noticed, but the one of the main characters in this book is named Michaela. She's called Mikey, and her last name is Deming. I picked up this book to read after last week's interview, and just had to say wow, because if you remember last week's main character, her name was Ashen Deming. Same last name, 2 weeks in a row. What are the odds of that? Probably they're related. in the random fictionalized world. Somebody get on that and do a genealogy. I just thought that was really interesting, and I'm always fascinated by the way coincidences happen like that. Back to the book, Purgatory Bay. It is a thriller. It is a book full of twists and turns. You already know who the villain is. It's Jubilee. You know that just by reading the blurb. So that's not the mystery that has to be figured out, but they have to figure out what her next step is, what she's going to do next, how they can find Mikey's sister and her daughter, do they have enough time, etc., etc. And they're going off of clues for a woman who has some definite mental health issues given the death of her family in this horrific killing. The story is told from multiple different perspectives, but it always comes back to this trio of women, to Jubilee, to Katya, and to Mikey. And they all have secrets in their past. They all have loss in their pasts. And in many ways, this story is about coming to terms with those secrets and figuring out how they're going to move forward beyond the mistakes they made, beyond the mistakes that they think they made. It's another book about choices. We've had a lot of books about choices in the last couple of weeks, which is pretty cool. So that is my take on Purgatory Bay. Again, I didn't used to gravitate to thrillers, but I was wrong. I was wrong to think the thrillers were only gory. That's not true. I was getting thrillers mixed up with horror. I admit it. I've admitted it before. I'm admitting it again. There's, still some thrillers that cross that line into blech. It's a technical term, really. But I'm having a new appreciation for the thrillers, and Purgatory Bay is one of them. So let's go ahead and turn to the interview with Bryan Gruley. Hi, Bryan. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for inviting me.
I am happy to have you here to talk about your new book, Purgatory Bay. Before we get to the book, though, if you could share a bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you, that would be great.
Sure. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan, where I first developed my love of ice hockey, which I've been playing for more than 50 years. For 40 of the past years, I've been a journalist. I'm still a journalist. I've written for small papers, large papers, the Wall Street Journal, and now Bloomberg Businessweek magazine. I tend to write long-form narratives about business. And I've also written 5 novels, all of which are set in my home state of Michigan, though not in Detroit. Northern Michigan, and in the case of Purgatory Bay, my latest novel, that's set in southwestern Michigan near a town I invented called Bleak Harbor, which is the title of the 4th novel, the one before Purgatory Bay. So I like to play hockey, I like to play guitar, and my wife and I just moved from Chicago, where we lived for 15 years, to St. Petersburg, Florida, where I'm sitting now next to our pool looking out on a canal where we just had a heron come and stand on our dock wondering who the heck are these people who moved into this house.
Nice. I think you should name the heron.
You're yeah. Fine. Harry the heron, I guess it was.
Oh, there you go. So give an overview of the story of Purgatory Bay.
Purgatory Bay is about a woman named Jubilee Rathman. As a 17-year-old, she had a very bright future. She was bound for Princeton to play soccer. She was an all-state soccer player, lived in a lovely suburb north of Detroit, and everything was going her way. And then one night, most of her family was murdered in what appeared to be a mob hit at their cottage in northern Michigan. They were all up there except Jubilee was home for soccer practice. And so this turns her life upside down, and it festers inside her. And the book opens 12 years after this tragedy, and Jubilee is living mostly alone in a fortress, a high-tech fortress on a bay called Purgatory, a little north of Bleak Harbor, which is a town on Lake Michigan on the western side of the state of Michigan. And Jubilee is now about to carry out a diabolical, somewhat brilliant plot to take revenge on a number of people she considers responsible for ruining her life. That's essentially what it's about. I had one consumer reviewer said it's really not a whodunit. You know who did it. It's more of a how are they going to stop this person, as she narrows in on some people that by the end of the book, the readers aren't going to want to suffer.
Right. We are going to take our first break of the podcast, and when we come back, we'll be talking more about the character of Jubilee and how it was writing such an interesting, complex, possibly crazy character. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Bryan Gruley about his book Purgatory Bay. Before the break, he was talking about kind of the overarching story of this book, and now we are turning to some of the characters within the book. I want to talk more about the character of Jubilee because she is a very complex villain, and there were times when I really wanted to sympathize with her because she does have those events in her past that are haunting her, but she, of course, made many different choices that led her to where she is in this book. So how was writing that character? Was it fairly easy, or was it more complicated than you expected? How did that process go for you?
It was harder than I thought, and I tried to give her some moments where you could, if not, like her. That's very hard. At least feel her pain, and it's clear that the way she has decided to go about salving her pain is, not only horrifying, but it's tragically mistaken. And you might not always think that, because many of the revenge plots are to some degree a staple of the genre. I remember when I was a kid, my dad loved those Charles Bronson movies, and it was always Bronson avenging some loved one's death by striking out against the bad guys. And in this case, Jubilee takes Charles Bronson's place, but she has purposely distanced herself from not just other humans, but humanity altogether, so that she can carry out this task. So,
and her,
she was hard. I didn't really know how hard she'd be. I just wanted to write this tale, and it comes to some degree from a dark spot in my own psyche, where I think of people, not just in American culture, in the whole world, who commit horrible deeds and never have to pay the price for them because they're powerful and or wealthy and or celebrities. They just keep going with their lives, and they never have to pay. And Jubilee is saying, you're going to pay, and you're going to pay in a way that you don't expect it. It's going to be more painful than you think it's going to, than you would imagine, because of the way she goes about doing what she does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't want to give too much away, although I do have other questions, but that would give too much away. So what was your initial inspiration for the book?
It's this rather odd. I don't know if it's inspiration, but it was a starting point. I woke up one night in the middle of the night, and I heard the song Ophelia by the band playing in my head. It's a great song. You might be too young to be that familiar with it, but actually Jim James of My Morning Jacket does a cover of Ophelia. I think he does a cover of Ophelia, or at least he does it live. It's really great. I think that's right. Anyway, and the opening lines are, bars on the window, mail at the door. Why would anybody leave so quickly for? Ophelia, where have you gone? And so there's a character named Ophelia in the book. She is a blind person. She's only been blind since her teen years, but she's very independent. She even has a car that she can't drive, but she insists on having a car.
Right.
Of course, it's a Volvo. The safest car, right?
Right.
Which I thought was funny, and probably nobody else does, but I did. Anyway, and so Ophelia, early in the book, I'm not giving too much away here, she disappears. And that was the initial inspiration, was Ophelia disappearing. And I can't remember exactly, Sarah. I don't remember if Jubilee was even in the picture at that point. I just don't. She may have been, or she may not have been. But I do remember the Ophelia thing. And then there was one other thing that played into this book. It's when I was a kid growing up in the Detroit area, my parents bought a cottage up north, about 200 miles. It's what we call the northern Lower Peninsula in Michigan, up north. And so this would have been in the late 60s. There was a family, the Robeson family, who were in their cottage up north, and somebody broke in and killed them all. And nobody found them for 3 weeks or something. It was horrific. And
yeah.
I read about this when I was like 10 years old in the Detroit News, and it just stayed with me. And then my parents bought this cottage, not terribly far from where the Robesons were murdered. And I would lie in the bed in our cottage, waiting for the whoever it was to come into our house and kill all of us.
Yeah.
It terrified me when I was a kid.
I bet.
And it stayed with. I've always thought about it, and in fact, there's a really good book about it, nonfiction book called "When Evil Came to Good Heart." Good Heart was the name of the town where they were killed, and I've read bits of that book, and it's really good. It's by a woman named Marty Link, and that is inspiration's a bad word, but it's the touching off point for the murders of Jubilee's family.
Mm-hmm. And so the book is told from a variety of different perspectives, but it keeps coming back to a character named Mikey, who happens to be Ophelia's sister. What about Mikey do you think will resonate with readers?
Well, Mikey, her name is Michaela because her father wanted a boy, so they named her Michaela, like Michael with an A on the end, and called her Mikey. And Mikey has some of her own tragedy in her past. Lost her brother when she was young, and it's more complicated than that, but I'll leave it there. And she was a reporter, a young reporter for a long time. Well, not for terribly long because she was young when she left. She had to quit at some point, which is sort of a sad presence in her soul. And she has a daughter, 15-year-old Bridget, who is a terrific hockey player. And so Mikey comes to Bleak Harbor to see her sister Ophelia, in part, but also because Bridget is playing in a major girls hockey tournament that happens to be hosted in this particular weekend in Bleak Harbor. And, there's the natural mother-daughter relationship that I hope will resonate with not just mothers and daughters, which is a pretty large part of our population, but with everybody, And Bridget is threatened, and so and Ophelia disappears, and so Mikey is thrust into the search for her sister and to defend her daughter and she doesn't really understand why, what's going on, and eventually she will, and she will also have to come to terms with choices she made in the past. And don't we all? Hopefully we're all fortunate enough not to have to make some of the, face some of the consequences of our choices, as Mikey does. But that's her lot in this book.
See, I told you that there were choices in this book. That would be a trilogy of choice books in the last couple of weeks. That was rude. I shouldn't have said I told you so. Let's go to our second break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking about more about choices and more about the secrets of the pasts of the characters and how those influence the story. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Bryan Gruley about his new novel, Purgatory Bay. And there's a definite thread of loss throughout this book. I mean, obviously Jubilee, her entire family was killed. Mikey's brother died. There's also the police chief, Katya, whose daughter died. So there's this thread of loss running through the book. Can you talk a little bit about that and your choice to kind of make those connections between the characters?
Sure. So Katya Malone is the police chief in Bleak Harbor, and she is one of the only two recurring characters from the first book, Bleak Harbor, the namesake book, Eva Nema's book. Katya in that book was a police officer. She wasn't yet chief, and she had to search for a boy, an autistic boy, who had been kidnapped. And that is not resolved to Katya's satisfaction, without giving much away. And so that sort of drags on her. That bothers her, especially when now she's facing another person who's disappeared. And at the same time, years before what happened in the first book, she lost her daughter, Louisa, in a car accident that Katya was at least partly to blame for. So she has that guilt to carry around. And so you have, to me, the book is about these three strong women. Jubilee, who's on this quest for revenge. Mikey, who ultimately is one of the targets, if not the primary target of her revenge. And Katya, who's trying to get between them and keep the one from encountering the other. She's the one. And all three of them share, terrible things in their past. And all three of them have to, deal with it in different ways that, the reader will judge to be right or wrong or not. That's up to the reader.
And so how much research did you do for the book? There's a lot of different technical aspects, especially Jubilee's entire home, and then there's an element with drones. So how much research did you do?
Not really that much. I just want to let my imagination do what it has to do. And then I had people I talked to about drones, about, in the previous book, autism, but drones, about some of the high-tech effects in Jubilee's home, and just to make sure I wasn't going too far afield. It's okay to go a little bit far afield. It's fiction, Sometimes people ask me about that, and I go, well, there's no such thing as a lightsaber either, but it's pretty cool. Star Wars. Granted, that's supposedly science fiction, but I guess what I mean is, once I asked, I was at some book thing, and Dennis Lehane was there, and he had just written The Given Day, and in the opening of The Given Day is a long prologue about Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, the great Yankee ball players, and these barnstorming tours they would go on through the South in the winter. And it's this really great story about the two of them. And I asked Dennis, did you do a lot of research on Ruth and Gehrig? And he said, no. He said, I really thought I knew those guys enough in my heart, in my imagination. I didn't want research to stilt it. So I just wrote it. And then at the end, I went and checked a few things to make sure I wasn't too crazy. So, for instance, he found out that Babe Ruth, in the period he wrote about him, was actually a very svelte guy. He hadn't gotten a big beer belly yet, so he changed that. And in my case, like the drones, I talk with a couple of profs who work on drones, and these are probably, they could be a little bit over the top, but not really. They're out there. There are some really interesting and horrifying potential uses of drones that people can hook up in a homemade way. I've actually seen them on these YouTube videos. Are pretty crude. And then, of course, there is a virtual assistant named Francis, who's quite a character. Jubilee goes on the dark web and gets coders and other people to develop these assistants for her, and she, like Murphy Brown from the old CBS series, she goes through these assistants like Murphy Brown went through her own assistants. So she's up to Francis because she had an A, a B, a C, a D, and an E, and Francis is her current one. And Francis is starting to annoy her by the end of the book, and I think she says Geraldine is going to be the next one. Geraldine with a G. And when I first wrote Francis, my editor, Liz Pearson at Thomas and Mercer, said, Francis, whoever made Francis ought to be working for Amazon, because we would love to have a virtual assistant this smart. And so I had,
yes.
but I ratcheted her back, and I think she's fine now. And surprisingly, I thought I'd get some complaints in my consumer reviews about Francis, but if they're there, I don't think I've seen them. In fact, the reviews in Purgatory Bay on Goodreads and on Amazon are the best reviews I've had for any of my books.
That's great. And I don't know, I kind of like Frances as a character, even though she's not really a character.
Yeah. Well, she brings she's a character in the
sense
that you say, that guy is a character.
Yes,
you know what I mean?
Exactly.
That's
exactly.
Frances is definitely that.
Yep. So yeah, she brings some much needed lightness at times. Now you mentioned Bleak Harbor and that Katya is in that book as well. So these are definitely books that they're standalone. You can read them by themselves. But are you planning more books in? It's not quite a series, but books that are set in the same place in Bleak Harbor?
I think it unlikely my next book will be set there. I'm working on something quite a bit different, and it would likely be set in the city of Detroit. So we'll see if that happens. Working with Thomas
Okay.
and Mercer, my good friends there, and hoping we're gonna start up something new there. Which isn't to say I will never return to Bleak Harbor, or for that matter, Starvation Lake, the town in northern Michigan where my first 3 books are set. Someday, I'd love to go back there if I can.
And we are going to talk more about that trilogy of books when we return from our break. I just have to say I'm always fascinated by place names like Starvation Lake. There is a place in Montana called Froze to Death Creek. Clearly there's a story there, and not a good one. So on that note, let's go ahead and take our break. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, Bryan had just mentioned the trilogy of books that he wrote before the 2 that are set in Purgatory Bay. So let's go ahead. Bleak Harbor. So let's go ahead and get back to the interview.
Which is actually a perfect segue into me asking you about that trilogy, which is where I was headed next. Can you talk a little bit about that trilogy?
Sure. Trilogy's it's a highfalutin word. And let me just say, it turned out to be a trilogy by accident, but it was never planned that way. In fact, I wrote a 4th book that nobody will ever see because it was so bad. It wasn't 4th in the order. It was actually between number 1, Starvation Lake, and number 2, The Hanging Tree. Anyway, so Starvation Lake is a little town in northern lower Michigan, probably 200 miles north of Detroit. It's a fictional town. There is a Starvation Lake, actual Starvation Lake in Michigan, but there's no town there. There's just a bar called The Hideaway where I've had more than a few beers in my life. And Starvation Lake's main character and narrator is a guy in his mid-30s named Gus Carpenter. Gus was born and raised in Starvation Lake. He became a journalist, and he went away, and he got to be quite a star at the fictitious Detroit Times in the city of Detroit. And then he committed an egregious ethical breach, and he had to return to Starvation Lake, his tail between his legs. And when the series begins, he's the associate editor of the Pine County Pilot, a little paper there. He also plays goaltender for in the men's league there in Starvation Lake, and he hangs out with his buddy Soupy Campbell, and dotes on his mother Bee. So there's 3 books, 3 different mysteries. The first one involves the death of Gus's hockey coach, and what he learns about it many years after the coach died, and some terrible things that were hidden away. The second, called The Hanging Tree, is about Gus's cousin, Gracie McBride, who is found at the beginning of the book hanging in a tree filled with shoes just outside Starvation Lake. And the third book, the Skeleton Box, is about the murder of a nun, and it's loosely based on a true story, a murder of a nun that occurred in northern Lower Michigan in the early 1900s. Spectacular murder case, one of the, still I believe, the longest murder trial in Michigan history. So, and it really, those 3 books, when I was done, I didn't plan it this way, but as I was finishing Skeleton Box, I realized that really what the arc of the 3 books, what's really happening, what it's really about is the relationship between Gus and his mom. Dee Carpenter is a frustrating character. She defines the phrase unreliable witness. She drives readers a little nuts because she doesn't always tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But by the end of the 3 books, you understand why. And she's a powerful character and a strong woman. And I admire her. So that's really what those 3 books are about. And somebody asked me at one of my book events, if you could have a beer with any of your characters, who would it be? And I didn't even hesitate. I said, Soupy, Gus's buddy in Starvation Lake, who's a fabulous hockey player and a lowlife. he's just he's a loser. He can't help himself. Drinks too much, plays around too much. Probably should have played in the NHL. And for reasons that become clear in the first book, he never did. Right. Lovable guy. The lovable goof.
So you write books that tend more towards the thriller side of things. Maybe a little mystery. I love the last part of the acknowledgments in your book where you thank your mom, and then you say later in life she was always asking me why I couldn't write a book like that Nicholas Sparks guy.
Right.
So what draws you to this particular genre for writing?
The short answer is I don't really know. When I first started, I simply wanted to write a novel, and I read and read mysteries and thrillers, but I read widely, read all sorts of stuff. One of my favorite books is 9 Stories, a collection by J.D. Salinger. Those aren't mysteries or thrillers, although I would argue that all of these novels have something in common. An author poses a question, you don't know the answer, and by the end of the book, you have your answer. But in the meantime, you're hanging on tenterhooks, right? You're on the edge of your seat to find out what the answer is. But anyway, I wrote this book, Starvation Lake, and it was, the publishing industry says, well, that's a mystery or a thriller. There was this one editor who, I got 26 rejections for Starvation Lake before Simon & Schuster gave me a 3-book deal. And I got all these great rejection letters, which could literally be used as blurbs. So, some of them are so praiseworthy, and then they just don't take the book. But this one editor said, Starvation Lake is too nuanced to be a genre mystery, but it's not quite literary fiction. And, I'll grant the editor the latter point. But on the former, I was like, too nuanced. I think nuance is what makes books great, makes stories great.
Yeah.
Where
I don't think that's giving readers enough credit.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny though. There's an epilogue to the story. That editor said, for me, Starvation Lake falls between 2 stools. Too nuanced, not literary fiction. Well, a couple of years later, I'm at a friend's book party, and her editor is there. And I'm talking with her, and I'm needling her about the publishing industry. I'm saying, you guys, you can't do anything unless you know, is it frozen food? Is it dairy? Is it produce? You got to have a label. And this editor says, well, some books fall between 2 stools. And I said, really? I have a rejection letter that says exactly that. And she got all uncomfortable and said, well, that's kind of a term of art. I'm like, yeah, I'm sure. So I go back to my emails. Sure enough, that was her.
Oh, no.
So, yeah, that was pretty funny. I mean, I'm not begrudging her. I've been an editor too in the journalism world, and you can't say yes to everything. You have to say no, and sometimes you say no to good, and sometimes you say yes to things that aren't good. So, you know, you do your best, call them as you see them.
Yeah.
Can't remember what your question was. I hope I answered it.
Yes.
I just gravitate to stories. Yeah, I don't know if, you know, most stories are mysteries of a sort, and I love great stories. So, and you know, I think if you've read even one of my books, you know that I also like characters who have lots of facets and angles, and they're not, you know, single purpose characters.
Right. You have been writing your whole career as a journalist and as a, what you said, business writer, right? Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, mostly. Yeah, I've written a lot of different stuff, but yeah, Wall Street Journal, Business Week, and I wrote business stuff for the papers before that. So yeah, I've written a lot about business.
We are off to another break, so stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, Bryan was talking about the kinds of nonfiction writing he has done throughout his career. So let's go ahead and get back to that interview. So then what was your impetus that finally led you to sit down and actually write a novel?
Well, really, from when I knew I wanted to write, that I loved writing, I was just a kid. And at that point, I wasn't even thinking about journalism. I was thinking about, I wanted to write novels, you know, when I was 10 years old or something. And I kind of think of nonfiction journalism as a detour I took, but, you know, in part out of necessity, because when I got out of Notre Dame in 1979, you know, I was going to write a novel about what? You know, shooting pool, drinking beer. You know, I didn't know shit. So, and I had to make a living. So I tried. You know, I had done some journalism at ND, and kind of, you know, I liked it. I liked the writing part of it, and I knew I wanted to write. And so, what I didn't really know was, am I going to like this daily reporting thing? You know, calling people up and reading documents, and going to school board meetings in those early years. And it turned out I really liked it. I thought it was fun. You know, it was really a challenge, like doing a puzzle. And so I just, you know, small weekly, daily in Kalamazoo, daily in Detroit. They moved me to Washington and the Wall Street Journal and so forth. But all along, particularly when I got to the Journal, but to some degree at the Detroit News as well, I would always gravitate towards narrative stories that, you know, have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that was my novelist's urge coming out, you know, to be a yarn spinner, a tale teller. And so finally I had an idea for a novel in the late 90s. And I wrote like 25,000 words. I gave it to my agent. She hated it, but there was this little glimmer of hockey, the sport I love and play still. And she said, why don't you give me a story about these middle-aged guys who play hockey in the middle of the night? And I immediately had an idea that became the center of Starvation Lake. And then I just started, it took me 4 years to write that book. And then I had a year's worth of rejection, and then one day, 3-book deal, which is awesome until, you realize I got to write the other 2 books.
Right.
So I ended up writing 3, and 1 I threw away. So
right.
it was great fun. And, so now I do both for now.
Mm-hmm. And so out of your particular journey through writing, would you have advice for people who would like to write a novel?
Yeah, I mean, the only, this is going to sound somewhat trite, but because it's true, the number one piece of advice I give anybody who brings this up with me, Sarah, is write. First rule of writing, ass in chair. Books don't write themselves. There's no software app or software package that you can buy that will write your book for you. You have to write it. And so I tell people, I'll tell them about my pal Michael Harvey, great author, a friend of mine. And Mike was a successful lawyer. He developed a TV show, The Cold Case Files, and he had an itch to write a novel. And so he told me he started writing 5 minutes a day, then 10 minutes, then 15, so forth. And now I think he's written 9 or 10 novels while doing all sorts of other stuff. So that's the main thing, is to write. And I guess I see all sorts of stuff online, and also if you go to author conferences, mystery thriller conferences, you get a lot of advice about, well, you have to have this kind of character and that kind of character. For me, this is my advice, and other authors might say this is wrong. I just say, write from your heart. Just get something out on paper. 20, 50,000, 80,000, 100,000 words. Get the story down, and then you can go back and fix it. But write it from your heart. The reader knows if they're being toyed with. And the truth is, some readers don't mind, or certain books would never sell. But that's the way that's the way of the world. But that's my advice. Write. Number one, just write, and then just write from your heart and see where it takes you. And if you love it, you'll love it. And if you don't, that's okay. Then just set it aside. I had a buddy. He died last year. Probably the best writer I've ever known personally. Brian Doyle, poet, essayist, novelist, just a brilliant writer. And he used to tease me. I'd write him these letters. We went to Notre Dame together. And I'd say, I really want to write a novel, et cetera, but I wasn't doing it. And Brian would say to me, Gruley, really, you just want to sign books at your book party. That's really what you want. And he was needling me, and he was also goading me, daring me to actually do what I kept saying I was going to do or wanted to do. And when I finally did it a few times over, and he read my books, he sent me this great note about how when we were in college, we wanted to be writers with a capital W. And only now, after, as he put it, carpentering thousands upon thousands of words, we were finally here. We were writers, small W. That was a great compliment from him.
Yeah. Wow. What a good friend. He was kind of your get a grip friend.
Yeah, great guy. Unbelievable writer. If you or your readers are ever interested, his book of essays, Grace Notes, is hilarious and heartbreaking and just gorgeous. He's the kind of guy, he writes these sentences and you think, well, who the hell am I kidding? If I tried to turn a phrase like Doyle, I'd separate a shoulder. So.
You mentioned that you tend to like to read mysteries and thrillers, which makes sense, but that you like a good story. So when you sit down to read, who are some of your go-to authors?
For mysteries and thrillers, I
Or
love
just
Gillian
any books in
Flynn's
general.
books. Yeah, well, Gillian Flynn's books I love. I love Steve Hamilton's stuff, maybe partly because he's a friend, but also because it's set. Most of it, the good stuff, is set in Michigan. I love Salinger to this day. It sits on my nightstand, and I pick it up, 9 stories, and I read one of those stories that I've read 20 times. I read it again. I used to love Hemingway, and I went back a couple of years ago, and I don't know what happened. It just wasn't the same anymore. I don't know. It's not, it's not you, it's me. That's what I would tell her.
Right.
But, the last 2 years, I have gone one book to another, reading them because people ask me to read them for potential blurbs. And I'm happy to do that. But would I have read all those books otherwise? I probably not, because I wouldn't have known about them. You know how it is. There's 80 million books.
Mm-hmm.
The last book I read that I just adored, I couldn't wait to get to it every day, was The Art of Fielding by Chad Harbach. Some people would say it's a baseball book because it has baseball in it, but it's really not. It's just this great old school novel with all these characters and these long, meticulously drawn out scenes. It's just a fabulous book. Another guy I like is a lot is Tim O'Brien. The Things They Carried, his book of stories about Vietnam, is one of my favorites, top 10. So, again, I meandered, so I'm not sure I answered your question all that well.
Yes, you answered my question because it was just, what you like to read. I'm just nosy about that.
Yeah, you should be.
I totally understand your point about reading books that you may never have heard of, because I do that every week now.
Yes.
For the podcast. And so, in fact, I never used to gravitate to thrillers, but I've been reading a lot of the podcast over the last couple of years, and I've learned to appreciate them more than I ever did before. So,
yeah, there's some terrific writers in the genre. Lehane is one of them. He's a fantastic writer. Another guy with the phrases that you're jealous reading.
Right.
Gillian's that way too. Just amazing phrase turner.
Last break of the podcast, and when we come back, we'll be wrapping up this interview with Bryan Gruley. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts social media podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts social media podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Bryan Gruley.
Well, Bryan, I know you have a website, so if you could share the website and where people might connect with you on social media?
Sure. My website is my name, BryanGruley.com. I'm on Facebook, Bryan Gruley. I'm on Instagram, at Bryan Gruley, Twitter at Bryan Gruley. You'll see, my fiction as well as my nonfiction. My last nonfiction story was on the cover of Business Week this week, and it's about how 3M ratcheted up its production of those very important N95 respirator masks. And I didn't make up any of that, I promise. I keep a very bright line between fiction and non-fiction, as I should. So, but fiction's a lot of fun.
I bet. I mean, you can create people like Francis, or not people.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, not people, but people, sort of.
Right. Exactly. So what else would you like for people to know at this point? We've talked a lot about your writing and your books, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to talk about?
I'm certain I'll think of something the minute I hang up.
Usually how it works for me.
Yeah, but no, you've asked excellent questions. My next book, as I said, it will be set somewhere else. The main character will be a woman in her late 30s, and she's a very peculiar type of lawyer. And the book, assuming it flies, will be more straightforward in terms of narrative, chronology and point of view than Bleak Harbor and Purgatory Bay, which are present tense, multiple points of view, and you have to pay attention. Not that this new work will be simple. I tend not to do that. It'll be simpler, at least in form. But the subjects that this character, her name is Devin Payne, the subjects she confronts and deals with are extremely complex, not just in legal ways, but in personal ways. She's involved with family law. So it's about families and the relationships between husbands, wives, partners, children, grandchildren.
Which is never simple.
Nope, never. I know I'm oldest of 6, so is my wife, and we have really great families, but simple? No. As my brother says, the 6 Gruley kids, there's no Indians. They're all cheap. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Well, you just moved to St. Petersburg like 2 days ago, right?
We got here Thursday night, so I'm talking to you on a Saturday. So yeah, 2 days ago.
Yeah.
Not even 48 hours. Yeah.
So in that 48 hours of physical distancing where you haven't really seen anything, do you think you'll set a book in your new home?
No, I doubt it very much. I don't know nearly enough. Now, might I set a scene in or around here? Oh, there's distinct possibility of that. I mean, even though my books so far are set in northern Michigan and southwestern Michigan, there are scenes in Chicago, Valparaiso, Indiana, Virginia, Detroit. There's a whole bunch of scenes in Detroit in all 5 books. And so, whatever strikes my fancy. Sometimes I just wing it, like Valparaiso appears in Bleak Harbor, and I just picked it at random. Like, how about Valparaiso? So I was driving back from northern Michigan to Chicago one weekend, and I'm like, I'm going to pass Valpo. I'm going to go there, see what it looks like, take some notes, see if I'm going to set a scene. So I get there, and I cannot find a parking spot. It's Valparaiso, Indiana, because it's the Popcorn Festival. Orville Redenbacher, however you say his name, he was born there.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That's Valparaiso's most famous person, and it was the Popcorn Festival. The Gin Blossoms were playing, and which is hilarious. And so I had to park like a mile from downtown and really be careful about the streets so I could find my way back. And then I wandered around, and it worked. You know, it really worked well for a particular character in Bleak Harbor to be there for some of the book. And it was fun.
I bet.
So,
I mean, wow, what are the odds that you choose that day?
So St. Pete, you know, who knows?
Well, might I suggest a children's book about Harry the Heron?
Here we go. Yeah.
You might have to bring the darkness. You might have to bring the darkness level down just a touch, but
yeah, just a touch. I could make it a serial killer. Or Henrietta the Heron. How about that? Harriet.
Well, they do
Harriet
have those long beaks. Yeah.
Yeah. It was beautiful. It was just standing down here, you know, and you see a dolphin go by. That's just. I'm sure these people here, they get used to that, but to me, it's just so cool to see a dolphin. You know.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, I grew up in Montana, and my parents would take us every year to the Glacier National Park to watch the salmon would spawn, and then the bald eagles would come to, of course, eat the salmon.
Oh.
Which is amazing and fascinating, right? Unless you're 6 and you've done it every year. As a kid, I was like, this is so boring.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yes.
I've never seen that except on TV. I'd love to see that in person.
Oh, they really are beautiful.
Yeah. I've seen bald eagles, but I've never seen them plucking the salmon out of the river. You know?
Right. So, well, Bryan, I'm going to let you get back to your St. Petersburg day and watching whatever wildlife happens to come by. Thank you so much for taking time, especially in the midst of moving, to talk to me about your book.
Thank you.
Thank you once again to Bryan for joining me, especially as he had just moved and is now in the process of unpacking. So good luck to Bryan on that. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. You know what I forgot to tell you at the beginning of this episode? I do have copies of Purgatory Bay to give away, so you should go check out the social media pages and find out how you can win a copy of this book. Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, GSMC Book Review, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. You'll need to leave a comment, but go look for those posts to see what books are available as giveaways right now. One of them is Purgatory Bay. So if you think this sounds interesting, or if you love a good thriller, then you should definitely check out the giveaway. Thank you again, as always. I hope that you are staying safe and staying inside. I hope that if you are a fan of this podcast, you will help us out by following us on social media, sharing, retweeting, doing all those wonderful things. But also, if you could give us a review, either written or 5-star, it would be extremely helpful to get this podcast out to book lovers like yourselves, and I would very greatly appreciate it. Hope you're having a great week so far. I hope that if you are a non-essential person, you are staying home. You are helping to flatten that curve. Stay home, stay hydrated, save lives, and during that process, I hope that there is lots and lots and lots of extra time to get lost in many, many good books. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.